China is by far the most advanced country in the world today.
In 2025.
Eric, over to you.
I like the word civilization you use, because China as Chinese civilization is 5,000 years. So when somebody say China as a nation, I was always share with them, it's not a nation, it's a civilization. So when anywhere you see a Chinese in any part of the world, they are bringing their civilization along with them. All right, they're in Africa, they're in South America, they're everywhere. There's a diaspora because
Eric, sorry to cut you. They're in my village. Yeah, I mean, the Chinese are in my village.
Are you serious?
In
Yes. Odogbolu?
Yeah.
Wow.
There are factories in Odogbolu and Okwawa that manufacture.
What are they manufacturing?
Factory. Not
factories.
Factories.
Whoa.
Factories. They manufacture building materials, pipes, a bunch of stuff
aluminum roofs
in my village. And they've been in my village for more than a decade.
So we're not even talking about like the cities now.
Forget the cities. In my village. And they've been there for over a decade. They have transformed the economy of my village. Because they create jobs. And yes, there are people who live in my village now the people who live in my village now, who are there because the Chinese are there. They're not indigenous to that village, but because there's a factory there and there are jobs to be had there, and every day those factories are expanding. It was one factory, it's now more than 3.
And that's the work of BRI. You see, let me further up why BRI is so important. Okay, I'm sharing about China before we go back to the US. Why? Number one thing about China, after when Deng Xiaoping came into play, don't talk about Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao, during those times, 15 million, 10% of the population of China died of starvation. 15 million. All right, because they had about 500 million then during Chairman Mao, 40 years, 49, I think, till 1976, around that time. Because they closed up the economy from the world, right? Starvation, 50 million of the population died of starvation. This is why when Deng Xiaoping took over, he said, this cannot go on anymore. We need to open up. We need to learn from the rest of the world. We need to learn from Singapore. We need to learn from everywhere and bring back and start the industry in manufacturing in China. And when they brought up 60 to 80, is it 60%? Easily 60% of their population out of poverty. They cannot stop there. The concern of the Chinese government or CCP central government is unemployment. This is the reason why this is a brilliant idea. They start the BRI project to build the Belt and Road across all continents so that they can export their technology and their labor, the Chinese labor, overseas. And this is why, Lumi, you are seeing the Chinese in Africa, and they will transfer their knowledge to the locals. So the ratio of workers in let's say in Nigeria, initially will be like maybe 80% Chinese, 20% locals. Then the ratio will increase to more locals coming after you train them. So you become 50-50 maybe, or even more locals in the future. But at the same time, they will be expanding their industries. And they will build their infrastructures. By doing so, when they they solve a lot of problems. They solve unemployment issue because China is way overdeveloped. Their manufacturing is more advanced than anyone in the world. They need to send the low to mid end manufacturing to the rest of the world. Right? They need to construct. Construction is always a major industry for jobs. Right? So they need to build infrastructure, they need to build industries, and they need to build to make sure their people, number one, do not get unemployed. So they take care of their blue collar workers. This is something that the Americans, the West, has never thought of. They neglected the blue collar worker. They shifted the whole education system to knowledge based, means degree instead of diploma. Today, you have too many degree holders without a job, oversupply of white collars, and you don't have enough supply of blue collars. You don't have diplomas. So the Chinese thinks of unemployment on all levels, blue and white collar, at all times, at all times. Because not everybody can afford a degree. Because education is getting very expensive.
Absolutely. Lami, do you have any questions for Eric? I mean, just like you said,
before,
just to finish on what you said about education being more expensive, every 5 years, if you look at the educational costs in universities, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in China, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's in the US, you see this exponential rise in degree courses, whether it's master's program, PhD, or first degrees, and yeah, most of them are just out of the reach of most people. But Lami, please take it away.
I was just going to reiterate some of the things that Eric has said. Because I've done quite a bit of business with the Chinese. I mean, I've done construction with the Chinese. One of our very first projects was a Chinese construction company coming from China to establish in Nigeria. And we did quite a bit of work together. And then one of my experiences is how intentional the Chinese government has been. So these guys came to Nigeria and they were a small bunch of young guys, okay? They were artisans effectively, led by one guy who was an engineer. And they came and they had funding from China to come and establish their company in Nigeria. And they took on a few projects. Those guys have never left. This is that was 1999.
Wow.
26 years old, those guys are still here. Okay. Then my experience in China is you go to China, you want to buy building materials. And you want to buy a piece of equipment, and you go to the factory and you sign an agreement. I'm buying this, for example, concrete making machine for $150,000, for example. What you're paying to that person on that day is about 25% of the cost of the equipment. They take
Wow,
that
that's low.
agreement. That's agreement. Is that low?
I mean, it's a deposit, right? It's a deposit on
Yeah. So you pay a deposit. He takes that agreement that you signed with your deposit to whatever bank it is. So if it's and the Chinese have so many different banks. So you work in for example, you make let me give you one now. Lights. You make lights. There are banks that fund the electrical lighting sector of the economy. All right. You do agriculture. You're buying agricultural equipment. There are banks that fund that. The guy takes your agreement to that bank. I think it used to be about between 25 and 40%. He takes your deposit and your agreement to the bank that's funding. That bank funds the development of whatever it is you're buying, because it's not really off the shelf. So they fund that thing. When it's ready, they notify you that your equipment is ready, your goods are ready. Then you pay your balance. Then the goods are shipped to you. But the man doesn't need you to fund 100% of your cost. He simply needs, and for that, there are comforts. For as long as you're dealing with the legitimate people, there's systems built in such that you will not lose your money. Yes, there are guys that buy on Alibaba that lose their money or whatever it is. But if you follow due process on Alibaba's website, they have structures in place to ensure that you're not cheated. You get the quality but you pay a little bit extra for those costs, for those checks and balances.
A little bit of premium.
But the problem is when you want to circumvent that process, then you get into trouble. But I'm buying it. Like I remember buying some concrete making equipment, and we paid a deposit. They produced it. When my equipment was ready, I got a call, an email. Equipment is ready. You send someone to verify it. Then you paid your balance, and then everything happened. The shipping process occurred and all that. But my point is that It's intentional. It's deliberate. Its entire system is set up to ensure that commerce takes place, and that if you're comfortable doing business with this Chinese businessman, you will continue to come back. It's central planning at its best, and China has succeeded because of that process. Okay, and you'll find people who, and they specialize. There are malls that deal with hotel furniture. There are malls that deal with um, factory equipment, whatever it is. I went to a town where they make bottling equipment. So you want to build a bottling plant, whether making water or soft drinks. There's a town that you go to where all they build in that town, that's what they specialize in. And everything's in place. Finance is in place. Everything's in place. And realistically, I don't see how the US will match that in terms of what is the average salary. The minimum wage in China compared to the minimum wage in the US. How do you compete with that? Structurally, I just don't see it. And so this idea that China is some backwoods, backwater village place, sorry, that hasn't been true for a few decades. It hasn't been true.
Speak on it.
I don't see it. I'll say something else as well. For the past couple of decades, every US administration has been talking about China and China and China, and either imposing tariffs or threatening to impose tariffs. So China has known for a long time that this day was coming.
Oh no, this time round, they are more prepared than the first Trump administration. They already know Trump is going to play the same game this round, and they are prepared. Honestly,
5,000 years of civilization, 5,000 years, and for the past, whether it was Barack Obama or George Bush or Joe Biden, or Bush the first, or Ron Reagan, every US government in the last couple of decades has been talking about China and how we need to fix China. China is cheating us. So they've either been leveraging sanctions or threatening sanctions. I remember when it was Japan, when the US talked about the trade deficit with Japan and how Japan is dumping goods in the US, and Japan's currency was deliberately undervalued to make exports cheaper and all that. And the Chinese were watching. And so for a 5,000-year-old civilization, you watched what happened with Japan, and then you watched what happened with successive US governments threatening China, and you think, okay, you know what? This day is going to come one day, and I need to be prepared. It seems to me like the only people that were not prepared was the US. It felt to me like China was prepared. They knew this day was coming, and they prepared accordingly. And it appeared that the only person who wasn't ready for it was the person that threw the first punch, was the US. Sorry, Eric, over to you.
no, Lomi, you said almost everything, but I just want to say something. Is like, the Chinese strategy is so damn comprehensive. So damn comprehensive. I just know it. Right? I told you they planned 50 years and they had milestones of 10 years in between. Right? 10 years, or 15 years, whatever. They started mining all the resources around the world. Whatever they can mine, they will mine, and they will stockpile in China, and they will use it for themselves, and they become the biggest trading house in the world for commodities and minerals. That's enough to kill anybody. US, you don't have enough minerals and commodities to produce anything. You don't own anything. You still have to buy from the trading houses. And the biggest trading houses in China, in the world, is in China now. You talk about any commodity, anything. It's like if you want to go to war, it's not how strong your weapons or your army is. It's do you have the logistic and the food to feed your army? If you do not have the food and logistics to feed the army, they're not going to fight the war for you.
Because they have to
They'll
eat.
die. They have to eat.
Yeah.
So if you want to kill a country, your enemy, look at where's their supply base. If you can destroy their supply base, they will surrender. They can't fight, even if they have the best weapon in the world. And if the Chinese has already cornered the commodity market, everything. Why are they in Africa? They're spending. They are even doing deficit spending in Africa. Do you believe, Bloomy? They're doing deficit spending in Africa. They know they're
Yes,
not going to recover this money. They're not going to recover this money for the
It's
next
a long term.
30 years.
So it's a
Of
long term
course.
play. It's a long term play.
5,000 years. 5,000 years of civilization.
It's a long term play. Eric, I have a couple of questions. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And thank you, Laomi, as well, for sharing your insight about the businesses you did in China. And, both of you have been able to share a lot of insight and value to this conversation. And I thank you both. China also responded with 125% tariff on US goods. So, from your view point, Eric, which sectors in the US do you think will feel the most pressure from this tariffs, and how is China looking at this from a strategic point of view?
Every sector of the US that are exporting the US goods to China will be affected.
Every. Okay.
Because whether we like it or not, after the US, the only biggest consumer market now is China. And they are actually expanding their domestic spending. The world, even Europe, anywhere, every country they're trying to export are trying to export into China. The irony is they're exporting what they are manufacturing, their own brand of they are manufacturing in China, and they're exporting to China. They're selling to China. One of the biggest market for Tesla is in China.
Yep.
So all the industries will be affected because. So I don't think there's any specific industries that are exempted from it.
And the reason why I just mentioned that question, and thanks for that, Eric. The reason why I mentioned that question is because I read somewhere that key technology products such as smartphones, the likes of Apple, laptops, and semiconductor equipment have been exempted from these tariffs. This exemption benefits major tech companies, as you mentioned earlier, like Apple, Nvidia, which rely obviously heavily on manufacturing in China. So does this change anything? Because this just happened today, and I thought, okay, this was a full blanket export tariffs, but now we're hearing that exemptions are applied to the mix now. And some, like you said earlier, they're trying to protect maybe the tech industry from being impacted by these tariffs. Does that change anything, or do you think things have to change strategically all around? Why are we saying you're making tariffs, but then we're exempting tech companies from the tariffs? What does this mean in the global sense of this conversation?
You see, the Western technocrats, right? The Western technocrats, their main market is still the North American market, right? And even the European market. So they are shooting their own food, by putting a tariff on their own tech brands, especially like whatever you call it, Nvidia and all the semiconductors, all the chip manufacturers, and you're talking about Apple and all that.
Yeah.
Apple biggest market is still in the US. The rest of the world have more options, right? So why are they exempting them out of this at this point? Is because they cannot afford these brands to suffer a loss in the stock market. Can you imagine if Apple, your main brand, is going to crash, and you crash it because of your trade, your tariff, you're going to crash Apple, knowing that Apple is being manufactured in China, imported into the US. So now basically Trump is backpedaling on the tech stocks. Look at who are the guys donating to his campaign. Are the technocrats, the major donors. They are his bosses.
The tech oligarchs.
The tech oligarchs are Trump's bosses.
You see Larry Ellis, you see Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and co in the room with this guy, Elon Musk, in the room. It's very interesting. I said something jokingly today in a group that Yemi and I are in, when we're talking about taking manufacturing back to the US. And I said something, I said, well, Yemi had posted a link about how an iPhone would now cost $3,000 in the US. And I said, well, look, you can actually take manufacturing back to the US. What will happen? And then Yemi asked the question that, what would happen to the rest of the world, to Africa? And I said, it was very simple. You have a ring fence around North America, or rather around the US. So you manufacture goods in the US for just the US. An iPhone will cost $3,000 in the US. An iPhone will still be manufactured in China for the rest of the world, right? So the iPhone will cost $3,000 in the US, and it will cost $1,000 in Africa. And Americans would not be able to buy an iPhone, and they'll be looking at it online and realizing that this thing I bought for $3,000 can be bought
It's
for
cheaper elsewhere.
But if you go out of the US on holiday and you try and bring an iPhone in, you're bringing in contraband. So you have to pay duty on it, just like you'd pay duty if you brought your car in. You pay the full duty on it, whatever the duties you pay that duty on it.
Messy.
Okay, messy. But what it does is, if you're an Apple, all right, where a big chunk of your revenue comes from sales in North America. See, we're at the beginning of a new quarter. These things that Trump has done, I want you to point something out. They were done at the beginning of a quarter, right? In a way that it avoids the end of, see, you do it towards the end of one quarter and beginning of another quarter, giving yourself time. But at the end of this quarter, don't forget, all these companies are publicly traded. And you have to give your quarterly reports at the end of this quarter. So imagine what happens when you now say, oh, our quarterly reports for Q2 of 2025 shows this huge decline in revenue. Plus, you have to then give your forecast for the following quarter and the rest of the year. You now give this forecast. Look, I trade, disclaimer, I trade equities. All right. I trade I'm an amateur trader. Okay. So I understand the impact of your quarterly returns on stock. I mean, you and I used to trade together now.
Of course.
So you understand when Apple releases their quarterly reports, and what happens to the markets is, when it comes to earnings week, you start to see the market sort of move depending on what the guys that make the S&P 500, all right, are the biggest companies in the world, right? They are the Nvidias, the Apples, the Amazons, the Facebooks, and of course the banks and what have you. But everything is so intertwined. You have your Berkshire Hathaway with a huge Berkshire Hathaway just sold, which is Warren Buffett's company, sold a huge chunk of their holdings in Apple recently. But you see, because everyone's so intertwined, just imagine the time when Apple says, "Oh, our results are bad." Nvidia announces poor results. Okay, it has an effect on the value of those companies, which has a knock-on effect on the value of the indexes, of the major indexes in the US stock market and the major markets. It is economic suicide. Can you imagine what it is? Just in the last few days, the S&P 500 has retreated what? It did, is it 10% losses in one day at some point? But it's lost like a lot of value. And it continues. And every time, so on Monday morning, I said something, I said something on Friday. I said, this man will announce some changes over the weekend and the markets will move, and then by Monday morning you're looking at something else. And here we are. It's insane. Eric, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
Do you think
Yeah.
this can really, really address the trade deficit that the US has with the rest of the world? Two questions. And so, will it address the trade deficit? One. And two, will manufacturing actually come back to the US because of this?
I think I answered this question at the start of this podcast.
Yes, you
Because
did.
basically,
You did. But
to shit.
I want you to sort of, given everything we've said now,
A deep dive.
I wanted, so, when you started, it was one thing. Now we've gone into a lot of detail and given people watching us, our viewers, some context as to how we're looking at these issues. Now, based on everything
Okay.
we've said, do you really think that manufacturing can come back and that you can address the trade surplus, given all the things that we've said now?
I give an example about it might be. I hope it's relevant. Recently, I watched a video on YouTube, and it was addressing the manufacturing in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in the textile industry. All right, and the Indonesian trade minister is making a very strong remark, saying that the Indonesian textile industry is suffering and losing their market share versus the Chinese product. And the reason behind it is because the Chinese has so much reinvested into the R&D and the advancement of their manufacturing. Like I said before, they reduced their workforce from 20,000 to 2,000. At the same time, they have automated and used AI. Whereas in Indonesia, and their production has went up 3 times. In Indonesia, they are still using the old method. They have not reinvested in anything in advancement. It's still very labor intensive. So using that as an example, how China, one thing interesting about China is they have not sat on their laurels at all, and they are keep on advancing to be more efficient, to increase their productivity, to have that competitive edge against the world. So there are so much barriers that China has already developed. Would you think it's possible for the US to bring back such manufacturing with don't have that they don't have the structure, they don't have the system.
That is it.
Don't talk about the money, the investment, the finance part, all that can be structured. You have to understand, I hear an example. I think there's a bridge in New York that need to be retrofit. One of the main bridge, right? And they were awarding it to the local construction
Contractors,
in
yeah.
the US. But none of them could actually meet the requirements because they have to retrofit the bridge at the same time the bridge needs to function
At the same time.
at the same time.
Okay.
End up that contract went to a Chinese company, and the Chinese managed to do it with innovative ideas, concept, with all the experience they have because they have been developing in China. And that's proof one thing, they are so much advanced and they are very innovative. They are not just hardworking, but they are very innovative, and they reinvest into R&D. Whereas, sadly to say, US educational system today is degenerating. So without that, I don't think the US have the quality to do it.
To bring
Eric,
back manufacturing back, and that's the longest question.
I'm going to chime into something that Eric just mentioned. Now, he mentioned specifically garments, like the clothing industry in was it Indonesia? You mentioned, Eric.
Yes, the textile industry.
Textile, yeah.
industry. So, in New York, there's somewhere called the Garment District, and I think
Soho,
a couple
right?
of weeks ago, the Garment District, and I think in Manhattan, and I think a couple of weeks ago, the one of the US, I think it was a trade secretary, was talking about bringing textile manufacturing back to the garment district. And I read an article about it. And the article said that's an impossible dream. That even at the nadir, even at the busiest point for the textile industry in the US, it was populated by poor immigrants. So even then, it was not lucrative for American citizens to work in that industry. It was the immigrants, it was the illegal immigrants, it was people, it was the poorest. And naturally, everyone who worked in that industry in the US was looking for a better job. And once they got a better job, they left. And that even at minimum wage, it is not economically viable to make clothes. At least, so luxury garments, perhaps. Luxury items with big ticket prices, yes. But the average, the t-shirts that you and I are wearing, okay, it is not economically viable for those things to be produced in the US. So it can never, ever happen. It can never come back. Because everyday items would then become, your Nikes would then become too expensive. And in economics, you have comparative and competitive advantages. Okay. You specialize in what you do best. And like Eric has said very clearly, America's focus has shifted to the high end of it, where services. Apple is more or less a services company, let's be honest. They get the bulk of their revenue now from selling you things, your iTunes, your Apple Music, your iCloud, and co. They're selling you a device to get you to buy services. Once you own your iPhone, you're probably subscribing to iCloud and Apple Music. And they're finding newer ways to get into your pocket. So the iPhone is simply a gateway to get into your pocket.
Yep.
Now, the core of their business is services, is less hardware and more of services, which is why, look, your iPod there was no way to keep making money from you on your iPod. You owned your music and that was it. But when they came up with Apple Music, where you now had to subscribe, it meant that you didn't have, I had a music library of 40,000 songs. And I stopped collecting music when Apple Music came around, when I could now subscribe to music. So rather than collecting music on my hard drive, I have more music than I could ever collect now. And so the notion that you bring back manufacturing when your business model has completely changed to a point where it's now subscription based, you're now there, but you want to now tank that, your competitive advantage, you want to tank it and go back to what you cannot do. There's a reason why those jobs left the US in the first place.
Simple.
I give another example today. Today. Every single pickup truck sold in the US is made in the US. Okay? You can't import a pickup truck into the US. And that's why there are no cheap pickup trucks in the US. None of those cheap Hiluxes that you find, those small pickups that you find in the UK, Yemi, those small, they don't exist in the US because it's not economically profitable to produce them. So you have the massive trucks and luxury trucks or whatever it is. In that way, there's already a disadvantage, but because they can't see it, they don't realize that those cheap Hiluxes that we get in the UK, get in Nigeria, 4-cylinder engines, you don't get those in the US. And it's because of the competitive advantage. You've now said, we will not let you import cheap trucks because cheap trucks were undercutting US manufactured trucks. And that, for me, I brought this up as a lesson just to illustrate the point that Eric was making. That if you insist on this manufacturing, then you lose out on the lower end of the market because it is not economically viable to be in the low. So the trucks that they drive in the US are looked as they're luxury trucks in Nigeria and here because they're expensive. But the work trucks, those actual workhorses, cannot be produced in the US. So they don't exist.
You have all the Japanese and coming up Chinese brands that are coming up, The Japanese trucks are being assembled and produced in Thailand. But they cannot even compete with the Chinese brand now coming up. They can't. Eventually you see the Chinese trucks being flooded into the market. We will
They're already
never,
here.
yeah, we will
Eric, sorry,
never.
in Nigeria, I think the stats are now that most of the new vehicles being sold in Nigeria are actually Chinese, followed by Koreans before you get to Japanese in Nigeria, because Chinese cars are just more affordable.
Yeah,
And
the
the
Toyotas
tech
and
is
the
catching up.
yeah
The tech is catching up.
yeah.
It's catching up big time, big time.